Hey YouTube, it's ICU, and today I'm going to be doing a full camera review for the iPhone 4S. And I'm not just going to talk about the picture capturing quality, I'm also going to talk about how it captures and handles videos. So first I'm going to start with the picture aspect of things, and I'm going to preface it by saying that this is by far the best camera that I've used on a mobile device. It's definitely better than the iPhone 4, and again, it's better than any other smartphone camera that I've used. Now this isn't just because it's 8 megapixels, because I know there are a lot of other cameras out there that are 8 megapixels. But the camera on the iPhone 4S puts those ones to shame, and that's simply because it has a increased aperture to let more light in, and it also has a fifth lens. So when you're talking about pictures and picture capture and quality, it's crucial to take into consideration the type of lens that's used, because megapixels aren't exactly everything. So with that said, here's the first picture, and this is one of the key points of the iPhone 4S's camera. It does a really great job at capturing crisp and vivid images with a lot of detail. Now here's another great example of a good picture, because the camera by itself can automatically focus on all points of the picture and bring them into perspective. But let's say you did tap to focus, it would focus on whatever you tap on. So if you focus on the foreground, then it will somewhat blur out the background, and the other way around. If you focus on the background, it will somewhat blur out the foreground. However, if you just leave it alone and if you just let it do it automatically, then it will try to focus on all aspects of the picture, which is what it's doing in this case. Now here's another great picture that was taken in perfect conditions that is extremely vivid and crisp. As you can see in the background, the sky is brought out perfectly, as well as the leaves in the trees and in the bushes surrounding the actual object. But with that said, the camera also has some weak points. So here's a picture that was taken, and the sun wasn't even necessarily close. It was just somewhat in the upper right hand corner where I was taking this picture, and some rays of sunlight got in, and as you can see, it definitely washes out this picture. Now if I had HDR on in this situation, it could possibly correct the mistake, but unfortunately I didn't, and I'm actually going to go over HDR later on in this video. So moving on to the focusing part of the camera, it doesn't necessarily do that good of a job. So here's an image that was zoomed in a little more than halfway, and I mean, it still looks all right, but it definitely doesn't even come close to comparing to a picture that was taken that wasn't zoomed in, like this picture, for instance. But again, because it is digital zoom, it's definitely not going to be as good as optical zoom on a regular camera, but because smartphones do use digital zoom, you've kind of got to cut it some slack, because considering how far it was zoomed in, it is actually fairly good for the digital zoom standard. Alright, so now I'm going to talk about HDR. For those of you that don't know, when you have HDR enabled, it takes 3 separate pictures at different exposures and it combines them to highlight the key points of your image. Now, in certain situations this can be good, and in certain situations this can be bad. Like for instance, when I was talking about how it was letting too much light in the previous picture I was going over as a weak point, it could actually fix that and correct it if I had HDR on, or at least somewhat fix it. So I'm going to show you guys an example of a washed out picture or a partially washed out picture in a second. But first I wanted to talk about everyday applications of it, like for instance, if you have good conditions and good lighting. So here's a picture of a palm tree that was taken, the lighting's fine, everything looks good, and this is with HDR off. Now this one is with HDR on. As you can see, it somewhat washes out the sky and certain parts of the palm tree, but again, it brings certain aspects of it to focus, like the shadows. But again, you can't really tell too much of a difference between the two pictures in this situation. Now for this one, it's also pretty good conditions for actually taking a picture. And as you can see, the flower looks decent and everything else in the picture looks decent as well. And this is with HDR off, but with HDR on, as you can see in this example, it did make the picture brighter and it did flesh out some of the color in the flower. And the house in the background is somewhat lighter. But for this picture, I think with HDR off, it definitely looks better. So you might be asking, when does HDR actually look good? Like I mentioned before, if you have too much light or if you have too little light, it does an excellent job at correcting that. So here's a picture of a TV with a couple cars in the background, and as you can see, the cars are washed out in the background because too much light is let in, and the TV is also somewhat washed out. and that's with HDR off. With HDR on, you can see the cars more easily, and the TV is also easier to see, and you don't get that washed out effect. Now, in this situation, I just took a picture of a water bottle with a book in front of it to kind of make it darker, and this is with HDR turned off. With it turned on, it does do a better job at highlighting the picture and bringing the water bottle to focus. So HDR definitely has its advantages and disadvantages. I wouldn't recommend using it in your everyday situation, but if you do use it, then a great time to have it turned on would be in situations with poor lighting. All right, so that concludes the picture portion of this review. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the video capturing quality now. All right, so to start off, I just wanted to say that the camera on the iPhone 4S does an excellent job at capturing video. And again, that is because it does record at up to full 1080p, and also because it does have that additional lens and it does have an increased aperture to let more light in. But the increased aperture can also be a disadvantage. So to start off, here's the first video. It's just of me walking down the street, and as you can see in the beginning, it does let way too much light in, and it does somewhat wash out the video, and that's similar to what we saw earlier in that one picture I showed you guys. So I kind of moved the iPhone away for a second, and it did focus back on what I was actually doing and what I was trying to recording, which was just me walking down the street. And it does actually look really great and crisp and vivid, and because it is 1080p, it is definitely HD, and it looks just amazing. However, the camera is supposed to have automatic image stabilization, and I don't really see that, and I haven't really seen that in any of the videos that I've taken. Now, all of the videos that I've taken where I've actually tried to look at the image stabilization is when I was walking around. So that leads me to believe that the image stabilization is simply for when you're trying to take like a video of your dog or a home video or something like that, where you're not actually walking and you're just panning the camera around. So it probably is just trying to reduce your hands shaking when you're recording. It's not actually meant to reduce you walking. So the image stabilization doesn't really work that well, but again, it is better than nothing when you're recording and when you're walking. So it is better than if you were taking a video with an iPhone 4, for instance. And also in this video, when I was actually trail running, it did a horrible job at image stabilization. So while it doesn't do a good job when you're walking, it definitely doesn't do a good job when you're running. All right, so now in this example, I walked up to a flower and I was trying to get a close-up of the flower when I was recording, and it wouldn't actually focus on the flower. It was simply focusing on the background every time I would try and tap to focus. Now, when I moved around and when I had the flower in the front of the camera and in the front of the phone, it did actually work correctly, and I was able to tap to focus on the flower. And again, when I do tap to focus, you can tell both times when it does focus on the background because it blurs out the foreground, and also when it focuses on the foreground because it blurs out the background. And it's the same way if you're actually taking a picture too, which is what I mentioned earlier. And also this video with the close-up of the flower was taken near dusk, so it does do an extremely good job at letting light in even when there isn't much light to begin with. So the camera on the iPhone 4S is absolutely amazing, and it's definitely revolutionary for a camera on a mobile phone, and it could definitely be a replacement for your typical point and shoot camera. However, if you're looking for things such as optical zoom or maybe better image stabilization, I would recommend keeping your point and shoot camera or your camcorder. And also keep in mind that I'm not the best at taking pictures and taking video. I just did the best that I could, and I highlighted some of the key points and weak points of the iPhone 4S's camera. So I hope you guys liked this video. Please remember to rate it up if you did. Let me know if you have any questions or comments down below in the comment section, and just be sure to subscribe to me if you aren't already to be notified every time I release a new video. And until next time, this is ICU signing out.